at the indictment that was given to King David for his sins against her husband Uriah, and saw God show up for injustice. He saw this terrible thing that was done to her and said, no, that's not going to stand. And after that, we also took a focus that, again, I feel like gets a little bit overlooked in some of these studies, and we looked at life in the royal harem, which is where Bathsheba was taken to by King David. Understanding her story, that was an important part of the society and culture that helps us to just get a better feel and better appreciation for what is happening in the scriptures. So within this context, we looked at how even though it was luxurious and opulent and the women of the harem were well taken care of, that doesn't mean it was a healthy situation generally. What happened was women inevitably started getting put in competition with one another for the king's highest favor. Because within this context, as we discussed, including what Bathsheba was now surrounded by, really the only option for women in this scenario was to have a son, and for that son to receive their father, the king's favor, and be designated as heir to succeed him on the throne. I won't give commentary on how I feel about that being a woman's only option, to strive for more security, for more agency, but that's kind of the situation we're looking in. So within this context, after everything Bathsheba had done and she was forcibly taken here, God still worked within this human construct, within this system, to help her and to continue doing justice for what had happened to her that was wrong. She gave birth to a boy named Solomon, who most of us are probably familiar with, who would one day become the king. So Solomon has been designated as the heir, and this poises Bathsheba to become the queen mother, who was one of the people within a royal court who had the most influence and the most, ultimately, a lot of power among everyone within that realm. So it was kind of in this situation that we left off. Now, part of that indictment consequences of what David had done was that his whole household would be plunged into this internal strife, this intrigue, See, he had a lot of kids. He had many, many wives, many concubines, and a lot of children as a result, and particularly sons who were the legitimate sons of a king, born of his wives. They kind of all tended to feel entitled to the throne. So only one heir could be had, but rarely was there agreement on this or contentment if you were not the one who was chosen as crown prince. And we do indeed see this play out in David's family. And that's where we pick up today, is with what I call the Adonijah Incident. To put it mildly, it was an incident. See, that competition wasn't limited to women and wives in the royal harem. This spread among the siblings as well, as they were vying for the throne, hoping to change their father, the king's, mind about who would succeed him. Even though Solomon had been designated as this heir, not everyone was content with that. And Adonijah, the son of one of David's other wives, was among those who wasn't keen on this scenario. Adonijah decided that he should be the king. At this point, he's David's eldest surviving son. So, as such, he thinks he should be king. So he starts laying groundwork and scheming and rallying support within and without palace walls, raising up an army, essentially backing him to say, I'm going to be the king. I am your crown prince. I am going to be king after my father. Doing this under everyone's noses. So we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 1. You're welcome to turn there if you want to follow along. I am in the New King James Version, as usual, as well as Hebrew. And any version you have, as usual, is perfectly good as well. So what's happening here is Adonijah has gotten so far in his usurpation scheme that he is now, with his little party of supporters, in the middle of making ritual sacrifices associated with the coronation of a new king, and he's gotten a pretty long way. So David, he's old at this point. He's ailing, he's effectively bedridden in what we're reading here. He's just not doing well. And in spite of evidently having some awareness that Adonijah was gathering troops for himself and giving off every red flag of usurpation, we're told in 1 Kings verse 6, his father, David, had not rebuked him at any time by saying, "Why have you done so?" So it's a little bit of weak family leadership happening, maybe. Anyway, he's getting away with it. Well, our friend Nathan the prophet, who you might remember from last time, he caught wind of these shenanigans, and he knew that Solomon was supposed to be the king after David, and he went straight to Bathsheba about it. So in 1 Kings, we'll pick up in verse 11. So Nathan spoke to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, saying, "Have you not heard that Adonijah, the son of Haggith, has become king, and David our Lord does not know it? Come, please let me now give you advice that you may save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. Go immediately to King David and say to him, 'Did you not, my lord, O king, swear to your maidservant, saying, Assuredly your son Solomon shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne? Why then has Adonijah become king? Then while you are still talking there with the king, I will also come in after you and confirm your words.' And Bathsheba immediately went into the king's bedchamber." So here, and we'll kind of follow this thread throughout the next portion of this, but this is starting to show us a lot about Bathsheba's influence and her position by this point. It's been many years now since she was taken into the royal harem as a wife, and since she has had several children by David. But here we see Nathan goes directly to her about this issue. He doesn't ask to speak to the man in charge. He doesn't go to anyone else. He knew, number one, this affects her. Number two, she can get stuff done. If she goes to the king, she clearly has this influence and an ability to reach him right away. And Bathsheba does go right straight to his bedchamber. No appointment necessary, as sometimes we see happening. It's preferable that you get a heads up, you get permission to go to the king. She just walks right in there. And David doesn't seem surprised by this. It's perfectly acceptable, even expected behavior maybe. So she goes into him and he just says, "What is it? What can I do for you?" So Bathsheba, in verse 16, bowed and did homage to the king. And David, again, he asks her, "What is your wish?" Then she said to him, "My lord, you swore by Yahweh your God to your maidservant, saying, Assuredly your son Solomon shall reign after me, and he shall sit on my throne. And now look, Adonijah has become king, and now, my lord the king, you do not know about it. He has sacrificed oxen and fatted cattle and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the sons of the king, Abiathar the priest, and Joab, the commander of the army. But Solomon your servant he has not invited. And as for you, my lord, O king, the eyes of all Israel are on you, that you should tell them who will sit on the throne of my lord the king after him. Otherwise it will happen, when my lord the king rests with his fathers, that I and my son Solomon will be counted as offenders." So this too is powerful, because Bathsheba not only is here impacting her own life and the life of her son, but the fate of a whole nation. The significance of this moment is hard to begin knowing where to unpack that. The implications of a usurpation being successful. This is government level. I mean, this affects everyone, all the people of Israel. And it feels a little bit to me, looking at this, like Bathsheba is advising the king like her grandfather before her, who, again, was an advisor on the king's council. And it's also very personal, because when she says that, look, when you die, Solomon and I were going to be counted as offenders. Another social aspect of life in this time, it was unfortunately very common when a new king took the throne to immediately set about getting rid of any potential rival claimants or other potential threats to their rule. And this usually involved executions, and it often started even with the king's own siblings, because they could stake a claim to the throne and try to overthrow him. We had talked about already this malcontent among a lot of the siblings, and different factions would split up, so it was an incredibly fraught situation. Now, if Adonijah succeeded, Bathsheba knew that Solomon, who had already been appointed heir, and probably herself as his mother, would be among the first targets. So there's no time to waste here. It was an incredibly urgent thing. And picking up in verse 22, just then, while she was still talking with the king, Nathan the prophet also came in. So he came, he offered corroboration to her report, kind of backed her up if needed. And essentially repeated what she had just said, confirming all of that. And Nathan asked, verse 27, jumping down, "Has this thing been done by my lord the king? And you have not told your servant who should sit on the throne of my lord the king after him? Did you authorize this?" So as they're discussing all of this, and David is now aware of the situation, he answered and said, "Call Bathsheba to me." So she came into the king's presence and stood before the king. And I love this. Now she's just standing here in this very equalizing kind of way. Some detail is easy to slip past, but it's, again, some of those social implications. And she waits to hear what he has to say. In verse 29, the king, David, took an oath and said, "As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from every distress, just as I swore to you by Yahweh, God of Israel, saying, assuredly Solomon your son shall be king after me, and he shall sit on my throne in my place, so I certainly will do this day." And in relief and respect, Bathsheba bowed with her face to the earth and paid homage to the king, and said, "Let my lord King David live forever." So David then calls in his priest, Nathan the prophet, the son of the priest, some of his people there, and they wasted no time in very publicly proclaiming Solomon to be the king. He was anointed, there were parades, there was music, there were all these shouts of jubilation, and it said that the noise of the celebration was so loud that it was as though the earth was torn with it. So, meanwhile, now that we have resolved this very dire situation, what is happening with Adonijah? So you remember he was in the middle of making these sacrifices and basically in the middle of his own self-coronation with his party of supporters that he had gathered. And they heard all of this noise that was going on in the city, so everyone's kind of like, "What? I guess that's for you?" Like, he goes, "Oh, well, this must be in celebration of me becoming king." Well, that was not so. The son of the priest at the time comes in, and Adonijah says, "Oh, this is a worthy man. I'm sure he comes bearing good news." No, he had to come and explain to Adonijah that Solomon had just been publicly made king. I guess somehow that had slipped David's mind earlier. I'm not sure how that happens, but I'm also not a royal. Maybe it could happen. So anyway, seems a bit of a mess. Anyway, but they resolved it now. Well, as Adonijah learns that, oh, my father who was sick has gotten up and has made all this happen, and now everyone is swearing allegiance to Solomon, my brother, this is not looking so good for me. And his supporters completely agreed, so they immediately abandoned him, Adonijah, and they hightailed it out to go and proclaim their allegiance to King Solomon. They did not want to be on the wrong side of this. There could be consequences for that. So Adonijah, all of a sudden it had been going so well for him, and now he finds his plans foiled, and he becomes terrified for his life. Because remember what we had said about this thing where a new king would tend to get rid of any potential threats to their throne? He was now afraid that Solomon would do to him what he probably would have done to Solomon. And so, thus deserted by his supporters and afraid for his life, Adonijah goes up and he grabs hold of the horns on the altar in the temple for dear life, this death grip. He is just holding on, and he refuses to move. So, picking up in verse, let me turn the page. Right, verse 50. This is a long chapter, a lot of verses. Now Adonijah was afraid of Solomon, so he arose and went and took hold of the horns of the altar. And so people went and told Solomon what was happening, saying, Adonijah is afraid of King Solomon. For look, he has taken hold of the horns of the altar, saying, let King Solomon swear to me today that he will not put his servant to death with the sword. So he will not move without a promise of clemency and mercy from his brother. So Solomon, newly crowned and very reasonably, says, if he proves himself a worthy man, not one hair of him shall fall to the earth. But if wickedness is found in him, he will die. So King Solomon sent them to bring him down from the altar. They had to physically remove this man from where he had claimed sanctuary. I'm sorry, it's not funny, but there's a comic element to this. We can laugh about it because we know it was okay, it was handled. So at this point, it is kind of funny. And he came to Solomon, fell down before him, the king, and Solomon said to Adonijah, go to your house, presumably under heavy surveillance, kind of suss him out, keep an eye on him. He's kind of proven that he's not trustworthy. So, and now Solomon, Bathsheba's son, is co-reigning with David in his final days. So they were on the throne together, governing Israel. David was mentoring him. And before too long, David died and was buried. So now Solomon is taken over solo. And Bathsheba, she is the queen mother. And in this position, we're coming to where her recorded story of the Old Testament is going to end. After Adonijah had spent some time in his house, again, probably being observed very carefully, we will go into 1 Kings chapter 2, in verse 13. There it is. So Adonijah, the son of Haggith, came to Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon. Now she immediately kind of has these warning bells going off, and understandably so. She would have been one of his targets if not too long ago, and they probably still didn't know exactly what he was up to. So she says, do you come peaceably? And he says, peaceably. Moreover, he said, I have something to say to you. She goes, say it. Very businesslike and brisk. He's going to kind of try to butter her up a little bit here, but Bathsheba's not having that. Then he, Adonijah, said, you know that the kingdom was mine, and all Israel has set their expectation on me that I should reign. I guess that's one way to interpret it. However, the kingdom has been turned over and has become my brother's, for it was his from the Lord. Now I ask one petition of you. Do not deny me. And she said to him again, say it. What do you want? Then he said, please speak to King Solomon, for he will not refuse you, that he may give me Abishag the Shunammite as a wife. So Bathsheba said, very well, I'll speak to the king for you. Who is Abishag the Shunammite, and why is she important? If we back up to the last chapter, Abishag the Shunammite was brought in to effectively serve as a nurse to David, because remember, he was bedridden, he was sick, and just not doing well. So at this time, there was some kind of essentially like a body heat treatment